Well, good evening everyone. Nice to see you all and to make this journey out to hear a rather important subject, a subject that I think affects all of us. We all have anxiety regarding what's going to happen in the future. No one can predict the future, and sometimes we have a certain amount of confidence that we think we know what's going to happen in the future, and then plans get upset through one thing or another. So what about when it relates to the globe, the planet on which we live? Well, what is the world coming to? You know, questions about the future of the world have always been around, and many predictions have been made over the course of decades. And you'll be aware of some of these methods that have been used to try and predict the future. They range from the carefully mapped out projections based on critical analysis of all the available data. For example, like the national census that happens every 10 years. All that data is collected and information is tabled, and then graphs are made to project what's going to happen in this country in the future and what they need to plan for. Or there's, and this one here is probably one that all of us will be familiar with because it's probably something that we do every day. Educated guesses. Educated guesswork from personal observation or research of our own. And we come to conclusions that determine certain actions that we will or we will not do. But then there's also the fear-mongering, the agenda that's been put forward by certain individuals who want to make you fear something because they want you to go in a different direction. You might think of political campaigns. Perhaps one that comes to mind, which has had repercussions in Europe when Britain left the EU. It was a lot of fear-mongering with the big bus that went around with the $350 million or pounds per week that the EU would take from Britain. And of course it turned out that that wasn't actually true, but that was their campaign. So a bit of fear-mongering. Or Mr. Trump in America, when he was campaigning, talked about immigrants eating all the dogs and the cats and creating fear-mongering about these immigrants that were all criminals coming over the border. So there's fear-mongering that's used. Or there's the straight-up, just fanciful stories used for entertainment. Many films and dramas are use that as a way to predict the future. So such predictions become the basis of how all of us go about our lives, whether they be local projections, just here in your own home or community, or global outlooks that affect the entire world community. But something to think about, and I'm sure this is what the title is trying to address tonight, the predictions made by the world community, the impact on the global scene, they eventually filter down and can affect each one of us at a local level. So although we're far removed from these events, sometimes they do have an impact on us. So just take one example. Let's just take money. Let's just take cash. Everyone needs cash. Everyone needs money to provide for our families and for our homes and for ourselves. So let's just see how money might affect. So we know that financial markets go up or down based on the mood of traders looking at the variety of global trends. And of course, Wall Street is one such place that will affect other markets. They say if Wall Street sneezes, then the rest of the world, including the ASX here in Australia, catch a cold. And we feel the repercussions of what happens on Wall Street. And so that can have knock-on effects to our own personal savings, our superannuation, our mortgage interest rates and such like. What about going on holidays? Money for holidays? Well, our cruises, our airfares are very vulnerable to global security, or the lack of security, to determine how much we should pay. And so when the Middle East shut down some weeks ago, when America bombed Iran, and Iran retaliated with missiles directed at Qatar, of course that's a major air route, and planes had to divert and go around and avoid that area, and that would affect pricing, and that affects fuel consumption on the planes. And so all of these things determine how much you will pay for your holiday. But of course, shipping movements, the cargo that's on all of the ships at sea, are often in waterways that experience turmoil, and that affects the price that we'll pay for our imported goods, our Temu items or our Amazon items online. Or if you don't like doing online shopping and you're still, bricks and mortar, and you go down to Westfields, well, we'll find that the prices are affected wherever we try and purchase them from. But even if we're not big spenders on all of those consumer items, maybe it's just our oil and gas at home that we're still heavily dependent on. The price of petrol at the pump, or gas to cook our food or heat our homes with, is severely affected by the security or lack thereof that's going on around us in the world. All of it have an impact on our finances, on how much consumer spending we may have left over at the end of the month. And just think back, it wasn't that long ago, some of us here were impacted by this to varying degrees. 2008, the GFC, the global financial crisis, started in America, but it was felt right across the globe, wasn't it? As the financial markets went into meltdown. But even more recently, the pandemic of 2020 and 21 created strains on our economic recovery. But even now, just 4 years on, we still are living or have a cost of living crisis, where goods and services are increasing due to all these external pressures, some from within our own country, but many from without our own country. They're increasing at a higher than desired rate of inflation, and yet our wages aren't increasing to match. And so we feel that in our pocket. But that's just one area, finances. There's also growing fears on a number of things, whether it's climate change, and of course the recent raging fires of Los Angeles, or the rising sea levels on small island countries like the Maldives, etc., are causing a lot of concern. But that drive to reduce global carbon emissions has also now turned the world's attention to new critical minerals like lithium, etc., to the fore. And there's this race now to mine these essential elements, once not even used, and in some cases not even known. Or the escalation of technology, which led firstly to a social media boom. But that's caused major impacts on our mental health and well-being, it's being discovered. So much so that here in Australia, we are among the first to ban such exposure to our teenagers. But more than just social media, now we have a new frontier in AI, artificial intelligence, a major leap for mankind, some say, or a massive threat to our existence, others say. And if not to our existence, at least to our jobs and our creative copyright material, at least. But perhaps the one that has the major or a major impact on us as a country, as well as individuals, is the geopolitical world. And we'll have a little bit to say about this a little bit later on, where there has been a great giant shake-up of the old world order, as the USA particularly begins to implement its policy of America first and starts to pull back and shrink back, and has seen Donald Trump, the President of the US, impose varying tariffs based on a belief that America has, for the last 80 years, or so since the end of the Second World War, been ripped off by all these other countries, particularly Europe, he says. And of course that's causing enormous impact on all these other countries who now have to sell their goods to the biggest economy in the world at a higher rate. There's also, though, on top of that, the geopolitical world is seeing at the moment two major conflicts. One in Europe with Russia and Ukraine, and one in the Middle East with Israel and Gaza. And they're causing enormous tensions in the world. Sydney Harbour Bridge was shut down with pro-Palestinian marches going across here in our own country, and we're so far removed from the Middle East. So keeping in mind the geopolitical structure of the world and the impact that it's having at the moment, some of these things here, I think, probably relate to global causes of anxiety. So it's not all of them, it's just some that I've thought might be relevant. And on each one of these we could do a whole session, but we just put them up for interest. There's been an enormous increase in mental illness, depression and anxiety being amongst the most predominant, and of course our title for tonight is anxiety. Is it causing anxiety? And it has been noted and graphed and researched that there has been a considerable increase on mental illness. But so has there been on poverty or homelessness or pollution or human trafficking. Human trafficking, I was reading, involves about the same number of people that live here in Australia. Around 25, 27 million people are trafficked throughout the world in any given year. It's an enormous amount. There's political division and divide right across the globe, particularly in Western countries with two major parties. There is enormous divide and division along the political fronts around the world. There's wealth inequality. There's global migration. There's healthcare issues. Can I even afford it? Here in our own state, hospital ramping is a #1 issue, and it's increasing. And especially after Peter Malinoukis pledged that he would reduce it, and that's how he got into power. So some of those things there may be what's causing you to feel a little anxious with what's going on in the world. Where's it going to? What's it leading to? What's going to happen? Well, we as Christadelphians believe the Bible has all the answers. We believe in the Bible, and we believe that the answers can be found there. And we believe the Bible has told us that it was God that created the world and everything therein. And the Bible tells us that he did so for his pleasure. So, does God take pleasure in our sufferings, in all these tensions and the impacts that it has on individuals? Can't he just intervene to stop it? Since he had the power to create it, surely he could intervene and just stop it? Well, no, to the first question, does he take pleasure in our sufferings? No. And yes, he can stop it. He could intervene. But it's actually far more involved than that, friends. And we only have a short time in which to cover this. So I want to just do sort of like a high-level synopsis, as it were, of the Bible's view of the meaning of life and what it says about our part in it and where it's all leading to. So if you have a Bible, you can follow along with these quotes, but I will put them on the screen as well. But the very opening words of our Bible in Genesis chapter 1 tells us exactly what we said before, that God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis 1 verse 1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. But he didn't do it accidentally. It wasn't like a bad experiment. He had a purpose in mind. There was a reason why he did this. That reason is found in a number of places, but in particular there's one that's quite pertinent for our evening tonight. It's found in the book of Numbers, chapter 14, verse 21, where God declares, "I live," he says, "and because of that all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord." That's my purpose. I determined to fill it with my glory. Now, it's a bit cryptic. What's God's glory? What does this mean? You know, it doesn't quite give us an identification as to what this glory is that he's going to fill it with. Well, there's another verse in Isaiah chapter 45 saying the same thing but using different words. Isaiah 45 and verse 18, it says, "For thus saith the Lord God that created the heavens," just like Genesis 1. "God himself that formed the earth. He hath established it. He created it not in vain." See, he had a purpose. He had a reason. He formed it to be inhabited. "I am the Lord, and there is none else." Now, if you notice, one verse, the Numbers quote, says that God plans to fill the earth with his glory, whereas the other quote says that God plans to fill the earth with people. He formed it to be inhabited. Inhabited, it means to be filled with people. People will inhabit this earth. Well, in what way? In what way will people fill this earth at the same time God's glory fills the earth? Well, I think it could be readily seen, just from that alone, that the glory is going to be seen in the people. God's glory will be seen in these people, and they will fill the entire earth. But what does it particularly mean? In what way? How will these individuals fill the earth with God's glory? Well, I just want to take a line of thinking at the moment that just shows us how this idea of filling something with God's glory is used in the Bible. Every other time you come across this phrase, "fill with God's glory," it's always about a building. I just put them up on the screen for you. Every occasion where it says God's going to fill something with his glory, every other occasion, other than the ones that talk about filling the earth with God's glory, every other occasion, and the ones about filling the earth with God's glory, there's about 3 or 4 of those, but every other occasion, it's about filling a building, a tabernacle, or a temple. You can see Exodus 40, the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Maybe just come to that one in Exodus, because this will set the scene. All the others will say much the same thing. Exodus 40, verse 34. Verse 34, "Then a cloud covered the tent of the congregation, and the glory of the Lord," there it is, that's that glory we talked about in Numbers 14, "filled the tabernacle." But so much so, in verse 35, it says that Moses was not able to enter into the tent of the congregation because the cloud abode thereon and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. It got into every single part of the tabernacle. Whatever might be your concept of God's glory, on this occasion it filled every part of the tabernacle. And it did the same thing some years later in 1 Kings 8. It filled the temple that Solomon built. Every part of it, so that people could not go into it because the glory was in there, and it thrust them out. I'm imagining it was really bright and a glorious light that just was unable to allow you to enter in. And it managed to dispel every part of darkness within that tabernacle or within that temple. Or in Ezekiel 43, a temple that hasn't been built. Again, the glory of the Lord fills that house. And Haggai 2 and Revelation 15 say the same thing. Now, the idea is that the temple was filled to the point that no one else could stay there. And I just want you to take that thought on board, because I want you to now see how the temple is used in the Bible frequently as a metaphor. So here's the literal temple, and it was filled with God's glory. But the idea of the temple, or tabernacle, is often taken in the Bible as a metaphor for us, for people, for our bodies. So just have a look at this idea. Jesus spoke of this in John chapter 2. He talked about, destroy this temple and I will raise it up in 3 days. And they thought he was talking about a literal temple, but he wasn't. He was talking about himself, his own body. 1 Corinthians 3, the temple of God is holy, which temple you are. The temple is a metaphor for people. 1 Corinthians 6, verse 19. What? Know ye not that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit which you have of God? You are the temple of God. And that's what 2 Corinthians 6:16 says. For you are the temple of the living God. And you may remember one occasion when Jesus actually drove out the corrupt people from God's temple, because he wanted it to be filled with everything to do with God. And there were individuals in there who were not acting like God, and he thrust them out. He drove them out. And the concept, the idea is just as God filled these literal buildings, these tabernacles, these temples with his glory, whereby there was nothing else left at all other than God's glory. Every corner, every nook and cranny was filled with that brilliant light of God's glory. The only thing in there belonged to God. He wants the same for us as people. He desires that we fill ourselves with him too, with his glory, so to speak, in every part of our lives, leaving no room for evil or corruption. And so that's why Jesus drove out those corrupt individuals, because they weren't filling God's house with things that were godly. Because buildings are really just a reflection of the people within them. So now take this idea and just think about buildings today. We have temple-like buildings today, literal buildings that are the seat of decision making. So that might be the office boardroom, where you may have a small family business. Maybe it won't be as plush as that if it's a small family business. It might be just in the upstairs lunchroom. But from the office boardroom, whether it be of big corporate banks or supermarket giants or big insurance companies, right up to Parliament House, all filled with people. So the literal building is filled with these people, the decision makers of the country, so to speak. From the boardroom, your own business or family business, right through to the governance of the country. But it may be also done not just in businesses. Maybe it's done in your family, and it might be in the living room or the family room, and that's where decisions are made. And so the living room, the literal living room, is filled with your family making decisions. And it might be from the living room of your house to the drawing room of the lodge in Canberra, where our Prime Minister lives. But Maybe we could go even bigger. We could go not just in our own country. We're talking on a geopolitical scale. Maybe it's also where governance is conducted in other more important buildings because they have such an impact on the world community. Places like the White House, but that could be the White House in Russia, or it could be the White House in the US. And it just happened to be a nice sunny day that day, but we were just recently there, and that's a photo that I took of the White House there, standing out the front with all these gates and not even being able to get up too close anyway. But the White House. But then again, it could be 10 Downing Street, whatever country you like to take. The leaders of all these countries are making decisions in buildings. Think further afield than just their dwelling places. Think of their parliaments. So that's the Duma in Russia, where all the decisions for the war in Ukraine are being made. And that's Capitol Hill. And the upper chamber, the House of Representatives there. We went into there, but you weren't allowed to take your phone in there to take a photograph in the House of Representatives or in the Senate. But Congress there, you can see it's an imposing building, and all these decisions are made in these buildings. But of course, it could be a collection of nations. It could be the United Nations, or it could be the European Parliament in Strasbourg. Now just think that if each person who attended these buildings were filled with God to the exclusion of anything impure, anything evil or corrupt, then those literal buildings could also be said to be filled with God's glory too, couldn't it? And yet sadly that's not true. If anything, these places are often amongst the most corrupt of places, where power and greed are at their peak. And that's what creates the cycle that filters down and generates the global tensions that impact us all that we were talking about earlier. Decisions made in these buildings. Donald Trump deciding to impose tariffs made in the Oval Office of the White House, and then comes out on the lawn and has his whiteboard with all these tariffs on them. The Liberation Day, he was calling it. And we get anxious about this. We can get tense, we can get worried about the impact that it will have upon us living here in Adelaide, Australia. But you see, don't be surprised, friends. The Bible, and again we turn to the Bible said that this is the truth of the matter. This is what to expect. Just taking this idea of glory, let's just follow this theme through a bit more. The Bible tells us that of course no one in those buildings can show God's glory. None of those buildings are filled with God's glory because, sadly, we all fall short of God's glory. So there's a quote in Romans chapter 3, verse 23 that tells quite plainly, all have sinned and fallen short of God's glory. We've come short. We've missed the mark. We aim for it, but we can't reach it, and we always fail. And there's not an individual on the planet that can escape that reality. All have sinned and fallen short of God's glory. No one is exempt. But why? Why are we all like this? Why do we experience all these tensions that's going on that causes us to feel anxious because someone in some house somewhere in the world, in some parliament, makes decisions that causes tension? Well, just a few chapters later in Romans chapter 5, we're clearly told by the Apostle Paul, wherefore, as by one man sin entered the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. So something happened just right at the beginning of creation, whereby a man and a woman, Adam and Eve, rebelled against God and sinned. As by one man sin entered the world. That one man was named Adam, and he failed to let God's glory fill every part of his temple, every part of his body. He allowed a wrong thought to enter in. He allowed a corrupt thought, an impure thought, and that was going to create a division inside him. But more than that, he followed through with that thought and openly and publicly chose to do the opposite to what God had said. God had said, don't eat the fruit of that tree. And he rebelled. He sinned. He let this corrupt behaviour push out any glimmer of God's glory from his mind. And it left only darkness, and it led to chaos. It led to ruin. He was driven out from God's presence. He basically thought only about himself, about his agenda, about his goal to be with his wife, his self-interest, and God was pushed out. And of course, that's what happens to all of us. That's how we think, that's how we act. Some of us are more selfish and more greedy and more power hungry than others, but we all have this same predicament. And many with these egotistical, greedy, power hungry, rebellious natures rise to the top and become placed in positions of power that make all these decisions that then cause us to have to live with the consequences and feel the impact of that, and then maybe feel anxious by it. All their decisions in these places of power are really all about their own self-interests and that of their business, how to enhance themselves, whether they're in that banking boardroom, trying to introduce some hidden fees that you don't know about to build up their bottom line, or sitting in a boardroom of the supermarket giants, putting up prices but blaming inflation when maybe it's not always down to inflation, or using false advertising, or mis-selling insurance to vulnerable people who don't need what you're selling them. All of these things have a major impact. Why? Because of what happened in Genesis chapter 2 and 3. Genesis chapter 3. Individuals who push their own agenda, push their own self-interests. As we saw last week, or maybe even just this week that's just gone. A convicted sex offender trying to stay on in Parliament. He didn't get his way, by the looks. The courts have weighed against him. But having said that, there is a convicted felon in power as the president of the largest economy and military in the world. The leader, so-called, of the free world that has a major impact on every other country in the world. Lie after lie, bribe after bribe, the implementing of Project 2025, packing every position from the FBI to ICE agents with loyalists to him, seeking to change the lines of districts in Texas right as we speak to increase the chances of 5 more seats flipping red rather than being blue, so that he gets a guaranteed midterm elections going his way. But then there's also the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, and his commissioner for children's rights by the name of Maria Lvova-Belova. They've been charged, haven't they, with war crimes against the children of Ukraine by the ICC. But the ICC has also accused Benjamin Netanyahu and his former minister, Yoav Gallant for crimes against humanity. That's being allegedly perpetrated in Gaza. But irrespective of that, Netanyahu also faces corruption charges in his own country, but currently has immunity while he remains Prime Minister. So these are in those big geopolitical areas we talked about, and all are under some criminal investigations, or even convicted. And the two biggest war zones creating much of the global tensions in the world have these three individuals right at the top, making all the decisions that then filter down and impact us. Trying to make a holiday, or just buy something online, or sell our goods to the American economy. So, can these leaders solve the world's issues? Can we look to them to relieve the anxiety, to reduce the tension? Has anything changed in the 6,000 years of history? A YouGov poll, I'm going to have to lift it up here a minute. A YouGov poll in the UK asked the question about whether or not people felt secure and whether or not a third world war was imminent. And they can you see it up there? Is it big enough? Oh, look, I should just look behind me. It's probably bigger on the screen behind me. They took their research from 6 countries: France, Spain, Italy, the US, Britain and Germany. And you can see it's from very likely to very unlikely. More people thought that we're heading in the next 10 years or so, or in the next 5 years, to a third world war. There's fear and there's tension that's facing people in those countries, but that's just a snapshot of really what's going on throughout the whole world. Are we close to World War III? That's the fear, that's the question on the minds of many, especially in the nuclear age. And especially as Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin have agreed to meet each other within the next week or so. No one knows where yet, but that's... Have they said, have they? In Alaska. Okay, so it's been determined it's going to be in Alaska. Are we heading for another world war, or has it even already started, says this article in The Guardian. So, what's going to happen? Is this the end of the matter? Are we simply to see a continual decline of humanity into ultimate self-destruction? Is that where we're heading? Well, that's not God's intentions. God, remember, has a purpose. He had a purpose to fill every part of this earth with his glory, which we've seen really means with people like himself. How does he propose to do that? Well, he means to rescue fallen man. He doesn't mean to leave man in his fallen state. A method of redeeming the rebellious, sinful mankind. He has a plan. And this plan involves providing one who could show God's glory in his own life, while at the same time being of human descent. So just come to John chapter 1. So we're just following this idea of glory. Every time we see this idea of glory, we're seeing a new part of how God plans to fill the earth with his glory. And in John chapter 1 verse 14, he introduces into the world an individual named Jesus Christ. We find his name mentioned in verse 17. But just go back to verse 14. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. We looked at his glory, says John. And lo and behold, when we saw his glory matched that of the Father, of God himself. The glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. And so this one individual is unlike any other individual. His body, his temple, was filled with God's glory every waking moment. There wasn't one day in the year where he kept a little bit to himself, where there was a dark corner just left for himself. Every part of him was filled with God's glory. So, quotes like this in Isaiah 50, it says, "The Lord God hath opened mine ear. I was not rebellious." Never, not once, not one day did he step back and say, "Look, I just can't do it anymore. I just want to let my hair down." No, not once. Philippians 2 says he became obedient unto death, so up to the day he died. And the type of death was not pleasant, even the death of the cross. He maintained his obedience even knowing that there was going to be an impending death on the cross. And though he died on a cross, his Father declared that he was not worthy of death. So he raised him to life again and gave him an immortal life, no longer subject to anything related to Adam. So that's the rescue plan. God planned to fill the earth with people like Jesus Christ. That's the whole high-level synopsis of how God plans to do it. He chose one individual. He helped that individual. And then anyone that becomes associated with that individual, God has decreed that he will save them too. So there's no reason to be anxious. God has a plan. He has a purpose. It is actually unfolding in the way we expect. It is unfolding in the way he has mapped out. Because for this plan to work, God has said, "I'm going to send my son back." This individual that never rebelled, that filled his life with God's glory in every waking moment, I'm going to send him back. And I'm going to send him back to rescue those that have chosen to accept him and identify with him in baptism and then seek to live like he did. I'm going to send him back. But at the same time as coming back to rescue those who identify with him and say, yes, that's what we want to be like. We just can't physically do it ourselves like he did, but we want to. We try to, and we seek help from God to do. When Jesus Christ comes back to implement that rescue, there's also going to be a showdown. A showdown with the egotistical, corrupt, rebellious leaders and their vast followers that currently are in the world at the moment. Because those individuals have no part to play in God's ultimate purpose of filling the earth with his glory. And the reason is because they've chosen not to fill their lives now with God's glory. All those buildings, not one of them are filled with God's glory. But he will rescue those who are like his son, those who have made their lives as much as is possible to model themselves on him. And where they fail, they acknowledge it, they confess it, they say sorry, and they seek forgiveness of it on the basis of the understanding of being identified with his son. So there's a showdown coming, friends. When might this be? Well, God, through the Bible, has given a number of clues, signs, if you like, that will herald his return. They're not cryptic ones. They're not riddles like Nostradamus's riddles and such like. They're clear, unambiguous signs for any to see and check for themselves. And this is the moment God plans to intervene. So can he intervene? Yes, he can. But he's going to do it in a way that rescues those who understand who God is, while at the same time having a showdown and dispensing with those who choose to ignore him. Now, we don't have time to really consider these. I'm going to go through these rather quickly. And there are many more than this. I've just put 4 up there. There could be 8, there could be 10, there could be 15 signs in the Bible quite clearly mapping out what will be happening at the time Jesus Christ returns. Since we had Luke 17 read, at least we'll try and cover this one in Luke 17, because this one here, it isn't really geopolitical in this one. This one is talking about just the society in which we live. And it's quite interesting because in Luke 17, a group of people called the Pharisees wanted to know when God's kingdom was coming. When would all of this showdown take place? Verse 20, and when he was demanded of the Pharisees when the kingdom of God should come. So just like we're asking, when's it going to happen? What's the time frame? Jesus was asked this some 2,000 years ago. And this is one of the things he said in answer to that. He says, verse 26, he says, as it was in the days of Noah, that's what it's going to be like in the days of the Son of Man. So if you want to get a bit of a feel for the time frame, if you see things happening in your day that match what was happening in Noah's day, then it could be that we're heading for this showdown. What were they doing? Verse 27, they did eat, they drank, they married wives, they were given in marriage until the day that Noah entered into the ark and the flood came and destroyed them all. Now, it's rather interesting that if you now wanted to go back to Genesis to find out where it is in Genesis that they were eating, drinking, marrying, and giving in marriage, you won't find a chapter or a verse that describes that. Let me show you what you will find. What does this lifestyle of just eating and drinking and marrying and getting engaged, that's what giving in marriage means, getting engaged, what does that reap? What does that cause? Well, in Genesis chapter 6, we're actually told that we're not told about them eating and drinking. We're told, actually, things like this. The wickedness of man was great. Every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. He was corrupt. Verse 11 goes on to say, the earth was corrupt before God and filled with violence. Do you have a sense of that feeling at the moment in our society, in our world? That it is corrupt and that it is filled with violence? We just talked about some high-level figures who use corruption as a tool, who then engage in wars and fill their borders with violence to try and get their way. That was the days of Noah. And Jesus says it's going to be like that when I return. He then moves on to another scenario called the days of Lot in verse 28. Likewise also as it was in the days of Lot. Again, they did eat, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they builded. Go back in Genesis and try and find where it says, chapter and verse, that in Sodom and Gomorrah they were eating, drinking, buying, selling, planting, building. You know, going on Amazon and buying all this stuff, or Temu, or whatever it might be, okay, down to Bunnings and buying and selling all your stuff. Find a chapter and verse in Genesis that describes what they were buying and selling. You won't find it. I'll tell you what you will find. Genesis 13, it says, "The men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly." Well, that's similar to Genesis 6. They were wicked. Wicked in what way? Well, actually, in regards to Sodom, in chapter 19, verse 7, the men of that city were renowned for their homosexuality. And in fact, the term to sodomize or sodomites is a phrase that's come down because of that practice. And Lot himself says to those who were demanding that they be able to participate in this activity, when two angels came to Lot's house, he said, "I pray you, brethren, do not so wickedly." So if you wanted to link 19 verse 7, the wickedly there, back to Genesis 13 verse 13, you can see what upset God. The men of Sodom were wicked. Is that something that's in our society? I would dare say that it is. And in many, particularly Western societies, but not exclusively. That's the days in which Jesus would return, it says. Just come over a few pages to Luke 21. Just briefly getting a sense or a feel for some of the signs that indicate this return is near, where God does want to fill the earth with his glory, and he will remove those who currently are not filling it with his glory and fill it with those who are choosing to follow him now. So here in Luke 21, we're told some words in verse 25. "And there shall be signs in the sun," or maybe go back to verse 24, "They shall fall by the edge of the sword and shall be led away captive into all nations." So this is the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And Jerusalem was going to stay and remain like that for a long period of time. Jesus says, "Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles for nigh on 2,000 years, until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled." So there will become a time when Jerusalem will no longer be in Gentile hands, it'll be back in Jewish hands. And that actually did happen in 1967. And around the same time, Jesus says, "There shall be signs in the sun, moon, and stars, and upon the earth distress of nations, with perplexity. The sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear, being anxious, being driven with anxiety, and for looking for those things which are coming on the earth." What's going to happen? Where's the world coming to? That's our title. "For the powers of heaven shall be shaken. And then shall they see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory." So that's the time period. And I think we can see some of those things happening as we speak. And the idea of the anxiety certainly comes out. People are deeply afraid of what's going to happen. Global unrest is generating this. It talks about distress of nations. Try living in Poland or Latvia or Estonia at the moment. Try being anywhere in the Middle East. Distress of nations. Is it going to get better or is it going to get worse? Does it look like Putin might back down and come to an agreement? It doesn't seem like it. He hasn't yet. None of the threats that Trump's made have caused him to change his mind. He has a goal. He wants to take Ukraine. He plans to do so. And then, who knows? Does he take Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania next? Does he move on to Moldova? Does he move down into the Middle East, to Syria? It's an amazing thing that Jesus knew that's how the world would be at the time when he would return. One prominent sign, and we've already seen a hint of it here in Luke 21 verse 24, Israel would be back in their land. The Jews would be back in their land. Ezekiel 36 plainly tells of the time that God would scatter them amongst the nations, but then in verse 24, I'm going to bring you back into your own land. I'm going to bring you back and put you, says Joel, into control of Judah and Jerusalem. Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem. 1948 for Israel and 1967 for Jerusalem. And that's how it's happened. It started with the first Zionist Congress that Theodor Herzl attended in 1897, and now look at it. They're trying to claim Gaza now. And they've said, we will take control of Gaza. The West Bank is next. So Putin's got his plans of expansion, and so has Benjamin Netanyahu. And Trump, can he cause either to hold back? It doesn't seem like it. Causing enormous distress of nations. But it shows that God said Israel would be back, and there they are. Jerusalem is in Jewish hands, and they will not give it up. Now, this one here, I was not sure how much time we would have, and we don't have any plans to go through these because time's already gone. But we just mentioned about Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel, and there's one chapter in the Bible which if you haven't investigated it, it's worth investigating. I've got slides here that we could show you and go through to prove that Russia does have ambitions, and they're not going to go away. And no matter how much we might think that Zelensky might be able to get his way and get more armaments from the European Union or such like, Russia has a plan to take Ukraine, the ancient land of Magog, and to plant himself in that ancient Russian territory for the purpose of building a confederate power. Just come to Ezekiel 38. Vladimir Putin deeply wants to recapture the original Russian Empire, the people of the Rus, the historical Russia. President Vladimir Putin has lamented the collapse of the Soviet Union 3 decades ago as a demise of what is called historical Russia, and said the economic crisis that followed was so bad he was forced to moonlight as a taxi driver. And he wants to reclaim that and build the Christian Roman Empire again. That's his plan, that's his ambition. He doesn't reveal all his cards, but it's quite clear that it's not just a war of politics, it's a holy war. He wants to reclaim the ancient Russian territory. Vladimir Putin goes to church, he puts on the cross, then he kills in the name of religion. He wants to reclaim the Ukraine. Now, when we start to see that, and we are now, Ezekiel 38 says it's going to grow, it's going to get bigger, and there's going to be an invasion by Russia into the Middle East. We don't know how long that will take to happen. We don't believe it will be too far away. But it's at that time the showdown takes place. So just come to Ezekiel 38 and just come into the second half of the chapter, and we'll just look at a verse here where God says, I've had enough. This is when I'll intervene. It's in verse 18. And it shall come to pass at the same time when Gog shall come against the land of Israel, saith the Lord God, that my fury shall come up in my face. And in verse 22, and I will plead against him, that is Gog, Russia, with pestilence, with blood, and I will rain upon him and upon his bands and all these people that are with him, and overflowing rain and great hailstones, fire and brimstone. Thus will I magnify myself and sanctify myself, and I will be known in the eyes of many nations, and they shall know that I am Yahweh. I plan to fill the earth with my glory. That's where we're heading. So, I'm going to have to just skip over these, but you can see this Confederate power in Ezekiel 38 will just grow and grow and grow until all that red area becomes one in mind. And you sort of think, oh, I can't see that at the moment. I can't see Europe and Russia agreeing. But the Bible says it's going to happen. The Bible says Russia will take Ukraine and then will move on. Whether militarily or whether it will use political agreements, we don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us exactly how. But they will all come to an agreement. There will be some opposing powers mentioned in chapter 38. Tarshish, Sheba and Dedan. They're in blue there. And they will say, we don't agree with you. We don't think what you're doing is right. It's quite interesting that just some years ago, Britain pulled out of the EU in what we mentioned earlier with Brexit. The Bible told us that that would happen. We expected it. And it did. And now we're saying, well, what's the next thing that we're expecting? Well, Russia's invasion of the Ukraine is clearly what the Bible said would be next. So it's very close, friends. This showdown is coming. And God's going to fill the earth with his glory. Well, what's going to happen to you? Where's your assurance going to come from? If you're feeling anxious, how can you be assured? Well, let's just finish with this verse here in Mark 16. Mark chapter 16 tells us how you can be involved, how you can escape this showdown that Jesus Christ will have with these egotistical world leaders and all their followers, and how you can be on his side, helping him fill the earth, fill the temple of God's earth with his glory. Mark 16. We'll just finalise our comments by just reading these verses here in verse 15 and 16. Jesus said unto them, his disciples, go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He that believes that gospel and is baptized shall be saved. But he that chooses not to believe is going to be condemned or destroyed. That's the choice. You can escape this. You can be assured. You just need faith. You need to believe. Faith gives that assurance. And then you don't need to be anxious. I hope, friends, that that's given you some confidence. Of course, it's a big subject, and we've gone over time trying to just show you some of those things. But don't despair. Be careful for nothing, Paul says. It's a phrase, it's the only time the word anxious occurs in the Bible. Be anxious for nothing, he says it in Philippians. Put your trust in God. And when Jesus Christ returns, he will look after you and ask you to help him fill the earth with God's glory.